Today I buried a young Canadian soldier, and I felt impelled to sit down right away and write to his mother. He was my son.
During World War I, Canon Frederick Scott is a Canadian Army chaplain. His 3 oldest boys are with him at the front. During the Battle of the Somme, Harry, his second son, is camped nearby, ready for the assault. Frederick Scott prays fervently for his son's survival. But Harry is killed in battle. His men bury him in haste where he fell. Scott desperately wants to give his boy a final blessing. He finds the grave and digs until he comes upon a body. It is unmistakably his son's.
My darling wife, there was dear Harry's left hand with the signet ring on his little finger. It was like a miracle to think that I had found him on that waste on which I could see many bodies still unburied. To think that I was able to touch his dear old hand once more. In a flash, all our memories of Harry, all the joy he was to us, crowded in upon my mind and broke me down. I thought of him as a boy at Drummondville and Quebec, and now, on this greatest of England's battlefields, our pride and our darling was lying.
Canon Scott removes Harry's signet ring to give to his son's new bride, Constance. Harry Scott had married Constance Hall only 4 months before leaving for the front. Constance will never remarry. At the dawn of Canada's century, the young country is plunged into the greatest war the world has ever seen. It will exact an inconceivable toll of death and destruction. It will be a time of horrific defeats and spectacular victories, of bitter conflict over who will fight. Every part of Canada, every person, every town and city will be transformed in the crucible of war. This is Canada's Ordeal by Fire.
Dear Maud, you in Canada cannot realize what war is like. You must see the barren deserts war has made of once fertile country. See the dead on the field, headless, legless, stomachless. You must have heard the screeching shells and have the shrapnel fall around you. And soldiers marching by these scenes as if they never knew of their presence. Until you've lived this, little woman, you cannot know.
Frederick Varley struggles to convey the horror of the war to his wife, Maud. Varley is one of a handful of war artists. They paint what words fail to describe. What they capture on canvas will be the most tragic episode of Canada's history, a monumental carnage and the bloodiest infantry war ever known to man.
When you hear the rolling of the drums, when you hear the martial music play, all the guns and bayonets are gleaming as the soldiers march away. When you think of the glory of their mission as they fight against cruelty and sin, don't you hear a still voice calling, awake, falling, falling?
When war is declared in 1914, Canadians expect it to be a short and glorious crusade for civilization and the empire. Fathers and sons sign up, brothers, underage boys, older men. Each has his reasons: patriotism, adventure, money. Most recruits are single, unemployed, and from the city. 70% of those who enlist are recent immigrants from Britain, eager to defend their homeland from the enemy. Propaganda films give that enemy a ruthless face. They help to boost enlistment, but they also spread the fear of foreigners. In Canada, immigrants from enemy countries are forced to register and to report regularly to the authorities. And while 8,000 immigrants are interned in labor camps across the country, new Canadian recruits are leaving for training camps in England.
We're going to wear a uniform. We're ready to fall in. We're going to help our country in her hour of need to win. Our king and country call on us to fight through thick and thin. In a khaki colored uniform, fall in.
Roy McPhee and his brothers Arthur and John are farm boys from Parry Sound, Ontario. They want to enlist, but they know they are also needed on the farm. Food production is essential to the war effort. Canada is the Allies' granary, but farm hands are scarce. Roy and Arthur McPhee decide to sign up for the same battalion. But John is kept back to help his little brother Norman and his 3 sisters on the family farm. Roy writes to his sister Muriel.
I hope the boys around there can manage to help you quite a bit this summer. Whenever they do, thank them for me, will you? Tell them there's a fellow out in France that will never forget it, and try to pay it back sometime.
To his father, Roy writes a painful letter.
I don't think I have enough worldly goods to bother making a will or anything like that. I think you will know what to do if I don't come back. I'll leave the colts to John, and the rest you can put onto the farm.
Roy McPhee goes to war with his parents' blessing. Arthur-Joseph Lapointe's parents oppose his decision to enlist. Lapointe is from the small village of Rivière-Blanche in the Gaspé Peninsula. He tries to console his mother.
Ah, poor maman. Forgive your son for all the sorrow he causes you. But over there, mothers are crying as well. The mothers of Belgium and France who have been chased from their homes. It is for them that I am going to fight.
Of his 10 brothers and sisters, only Alphonse is at the train station to see him off.
The train will be leaving soon, and I know that I will probably never again see my brother who stands before me. An officer's voice calls out, "It is time to leave." My God, what a sacrifice. I never thought it would be so difficult.
French Canadians have been in Canada for generations. They feel little attachment to France and even less to England, rejecting the British imperialism of many English Canadians. To make matters worse, English is the language of the army. The military's efforts to rouse support fail miserably in French Canada. And yet, despite the need for soldiers, Japanese Canadians face bigoted recruiting policies and must fight to enlist. Black soldiers are limited to a construction battalion. Natives also face many obstacles. Still, 1/3 of able-bodied Native men join the army, all voluntarily. Mike Mountain Horse and his 2 brothers of the Blood Tribe sail to France.
The attitude of my people during World War I is sufficient proof of their right to be called British subjects. The war proves that the fighting spirit of my tribe has not been quenched through reservation life. When duty calls, we are there. Our people show all the bravery of our warriors of old.
Nellie McClung is a pacifist, but this war is about saving humanity. McClung is a dynamic and controversial leader for women's suffrage and prohibition. She is also the mother of 5 children. By the winter of 1915, her oldest son, Jack, has enlisted and is on his way to the front.
This morning we said goodbye to our dear son Jack at the CNR station. Strange fate, surely, for a boy who never has had a gun in his hands. What have I done to you in letting you go into this inferno of war? And how could I hold you back without breaking your heart?
Frank Maheu, a lumberjack from Quebec, also has 5 children. He enlists in order to better provide for his family. To his son, he addresses a simple request.
I want you to be a good boy. And every night and every morning, when you say your prayer, say a prayer for Papa.
What has womanhood done for Canada? They are doing their part today. Sons they bore, they have given gladly. Now they toil for them whilst away. Think, yes, think of the girls of Canada. Not 1 minute they waste each day. For they work on farm or they work in factory. All for those who have gone away.
Elsa Michener is studying voice and performing in New York, but she packs her bags and comes home to Toronto to do her bit.
I joined the Red Cross and helped roll bandages and knit socks. My first ones were big enough to fit an elephant. And after that, I became so proficient that I knit a pair of socks a day without any trouble. You see, everybody felt they had to do something. You couldn't just sit there.
The call of duty takes other Canadian women overseas. Claire Gass from Nova Scotia is one of 2,000 nursing sisters with the rank of lieutenant. 4 of her brothers also enlist, although she attempts to get her younger brother to wait.
Mother, don't allow Blanchard to enlist. He is far too young. His duty to his country at present is to play the man at home and stick to his lessons. Until the government requires 16 and 17-year-old boys to enlist, it is wrong for them to go, surely.
Despite her pleas, Blanchard Gass joins his sister at the front. Claire Gass can go to war. Nellie McClung can send her son off to fight. But despite their contributions, they cannot vote.
We have seen our brave lads go out from us in health and hope, amid music and cheers. And already we know that some of them will not come back. Killed in action, died of wounds, missing, say the brief dispatches, which tell us that we have made our investment of blood.
Nellie McClung takes aim at the Election Act of the Dominion of Canada.
No woman, idiot, lunatic, or criminal shall vote.
The suffragists believe they possess the moral superiority that comes with their role of mother and homemaker. They want the vote to protect themselves and their children, especially from the evils of liquor.
When the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world, it will be a safer, cleaner world for the occupant of the cradle.
Henri Bourassa, editor of the influential newspaper Le Devoir, is opposed to women's suffrage. He fears for the sanctity of the family.
It is the introduction of feminism in its most noxious guise, the voter woman, who will soon spawn the man woman, that hybrid and repugnant monster who will kill the mother woman and the woman woman.
Author Stephen Leacock fears more for the sanctity of his social club.
I was sitting the other day with another thing like myself, a man. At the next table were a group of superior beings in silk, talking. "When women have the vote," said one, "there will be no more war. The women will forbid it. There will be no more poverty, no disease, no germs, no cigarette smoking, and nothing to drink but water." It seemed a gloomy world.
The war provides new ammunition to the prohibitionists. They claim that alcohol production uses up precious grain and that liquor weakens the soldiers and factory workers so essential to the war effort. Stephen Leacock is dismayed that they just might win the battle.
There are a certain number of deeply religious, patriotic, and estimable people who actually believe that in passing a law to make it a crime to sell a glass of beer, they are doing the work of Christ on earth.
There are people who tell us women must not invade the realm of politics where matters relating to the liquor traffic are dealt with. Women have not been the invaders. The liquor traffic has invaded a woman's place in life.
Canada is a hard-drinking country with only one dry province, Prince Edward Island. The tavern is often a refuge for working men, an escape from the brutal weather, poor accommodation, low wages, and harsh working conditions. But many men drink away their wages, leaving their families in poverty. Temperance groups have been spreading the word for decades by every possible means. For Nellie McClung, alcohol is the worst enemy of women and children.
We despise the army of the Kaiser for dropping bombs on defenseless people and shooting down women and children. The liquor traffic has waged war on women and children all down the centuries. 3,000 women were killed in the United States in 1 year by their own husbands who were under the influence of liquor. Non-combatants.
In Ontario, prohibitionists organize parades and sign petitions, but the heart of the reform movement is in Western Canada. So victory is especially sweet in the prairies in 1915, when the Saskatchewan government closes all bars and saloons, followed closely by Alberta and Manitoba. By 1916, women have also won the battle for the vote in the 3 prairie provinces. The other provinces follow suit, but Quebec holds out on both fronts. Henri Bourassa is unyielding.
I will never succumb to such an excess as prohibition, an English and Protestant invention which doesn't appeal to me in the least. Temperance is virtue, but prohibition is tyranny.
In 1918, the Canadian government outlaws the production of alcoholic beverages. It also grants the federal vote to women. But women in Quebec will have to wait another 25 years to get the provincial vote. In this reformed and dry Canada, it is still possible to drink. Alcohol is permitted for scientific, medical, or religious reasons. Long lineups at the local drugstore are common, especially on holidays when many men are suddenly stricken with a disease requiring a prescription for brandy. At the front, Canadian soldiers are bolstered before battle with a shot of rum, unless their commanding officer is a devout prohibitionist. Then the troops get hot soup instead.
There is a news story going around every few days about where we are going. I don't care where it is, as long as there's no mud.
It is a simple wish, but Roy McPhee will spend the next 4 years engulfed in mud and filth, in trenches filled with rats, lice, and rotting bodies. When the McPhee brothers enlist, Canada has virtually no professional army. Most recruits are young, inexperienced, poorly trained, and badly equipped. The daily misery of trench warfare will be their teacher. John McPhee gets only one lesson. He had waited patiently 2 years to join his brothers, Arthur and Roy. By the time he arrives in Europe, Arthur is already wounded. Roy is at the front, and John joins his battalion. He writes to his sister, Gladys.
Dear Gladys, we have got up to our battalion. Have been here 4 or 5 days. I was up to the trenches for one day. I saw Roy and will be able to see him quite often. He seems to be tough and good. He looks just as fat as ever.
It is John's first and last letter from the front. The 19-year-old is killed in the first hours of battle. His brother, Arthur, writes home.
Dear Mother and Father, this will be a terrible shock for you folk, as you will have hardly heard that John was in France before you get the word. But if he is gone now, it was because he didn't hang back any. And I know that you would sooner hear the killed in action than to ever hear that a McPhee hung back.
As part of the British Empire, Canada fights for the Allied forces, France, Russia, Great Britain, and their colonies. By 1916, Italy, Romania, Greece, and Portugal have joined them. The Allied armies are pitted against the Central Powers, anchored by Germany and Austria-Hungary. The major Canadian battles take place on the Western Front. In one day alone at Ypres, the 1st Canadian Division loses half of its men for a gain of a few hundred meters. The battles of Festubert and Givenchy in 1915 and Saint-Éloi and Mont-Sorel in 1916 establish Canada as a fighting force. The casualties are great and the gains are few, but no battles are as bloody as the Somme offensive. The Battle of the Somme begins on July 1st, 1916. Heroic reenactments are shown to those at home. In reality, outdated military tactics are no match for the new weapons of war. The men are often mowed down by machine gun fire as they leave their own defenses. Newfoundland's 1st Regiment is devastated. In the first half hour of the first day of battle, all but 68 of the 798 men are killed or injured. These images are not shown back home. Canada enters the Somme offensive head-on in September 1916. So does Frank Maheu.
We were walking on dead soldiers, and the worse. There were about 3 feet of mud and water. I saw poor fellows trying to bandage their wounds. Bombs, heavy shells, were falling all over them. Poor Angeline. It is the worst sight that a man ever wants to see.
The German and Allied armies lose over 1 million men in the slaughter of the Somme, a staggering price to pay for a mere 10 kilometers of territory. The Germans call this Das Blutbad, the bloodbath. Nurse Claire Gass treats the survivors. Many would prefer to die.
All are so brave, and yet those who are not badly wounded are so tired of the war. Tired in such a hopeless way. Some terrible cases. Oh, so much the better dead. One young lad with eyes and nose all gone. One blur of mangled flesh. And body whole and sound.
As the war drags on, Claire Gass's patients are treated and returned to the front, if possible. There are not enough new recruits to replace the wounded, the dead, the shell-shocked.
I saw poor fellows. But thank God, only a few lose their nerves like crazy men. You can do nothing with them.
Some take great risks to avoid battle. Sergeant William Alexander from Alberta has been known to dodge the column. He fails to present himself at 0 hour when ordered to lead a platoon in an attack. He is found 2 days later, court-martialed and sentenced to death. To maintain discipline, the British Army executes its deserters. So does the Canadian Corps. Only the Australian Corps refuses to do so. Canon Frederick Scott prepares Sergeant Alexander for his execution.
He turned to me and said, "Sir, is there any hope?" I said, "No, I'm afraid there is not." I pointed out that he had just one chance left to prove his courage and set himself right before the world. I urged him to go out and meet death bravely.
Sergeant Alexander is shot by members of his own battalion at 6:10 a.m. the following day. Arthur Joseph Lapointe remembers having to parade past the body of one of his executed comrades.
His tunic was splattered with blood, and his head hung down on his chest. His face had such an air of resignation that he seemed to be smiling weakly, even in death. I carry with me such a vivid image of that horrible spectacle. It seems I will never forget it.
22 Canadian soldiers are executed for desertion during World War I. In 1916, Prime Minister Borden had increased Canada's military commitment to 500,000 men. All were to be volunteers, but as casualties mount and enrollment drops, this commitment will become the dominant political issue in Canada. In the fall of 1916, Joseph Flavel, head of the Imperial Munitions Board, sails to France to see for himself what the war looks like on the banks of the Somme. The major offensive is over. The battlefield is a sea of frozen mud and rotting bodies. It is an unforgettable sight.
My God, what have these poor men done? What have these men done that they must be punished in this way?
From the beginning of the war, there had been complaints about the shoddy supplies given to Canadian soldiers. Their boots rotted in the mud. Their uniforms disintegrated. Their trenching shovels were utterly useless. Even more troubling was the Ross rifle. Thousands of Canadian infantrymen found themselves frantically trying to free jammed mechanisms in the face of an attack. It is replaced by the British rifle, the Lee Enfield. Canon Frederick Scott is unforgiving.
The Ross rifle is the greatest crime ever perpetrated against the soldier boys and their loved ones. The blood of Canadians wasn't worth the filthy gold that somebody made out of it.
Colonel Sam Hughes, the Minister of Militia, was responsible for many of the munitions and equipment that ended up on the field. He championed the Ross rifle. He was also responsible for giving his cronies contracts. Sam Hughes is fired in 1916. That is when Joseph Flavel, a rich and successful businessman, takes charge. His slaughterhouse and bacon exporting business had helped earn Toronto its Hogtown label. Flavel is also a fervent churchgoer and non-drinker with impeccable business credentials. He immediately imposes strict profit margins.
The waste and extravagance in securing supplies for war is appalling and must run into fabulous figures.
Then, Flavel visits the front. War has become a big business for Canadian manufacturers, but they are not geared up to meet the challenge, and Flavel chastises them about delays and poor quality. As for profits...
Profits? I come straight from the seat of a nation, where they are sweating blood to win this war. And I stand before you stripped of many ideas. Profits? Send profits to hell, where they belong.
But profits soon become Joseph Flavel's worst nightmare. He is shattered by a terrible revelation printed across the front pages of countless newspapers and magazines. Saturday Night Magazine accuses Flavel of profiteering.
The most sordid and despicable trafficking, namely the accumulation of great wealth out of the blood and agony of those who fight in the trenches, and of their women and children who are now living scantily on the pittance of a soldier's pay.
Joseph Flavel insists he is innocent. The accusations arise from the fact that his pork trading business, the William Davies Company, had earned a profit of nearly 80% in 1916 and again in 1917. A royal commission clears Flavel of all charges of unethical business practices, but the war is a crusade and there are no shades of gray. Flavel will be forever scorned as the Baron of Bacon.
Shall we close this chapter? It is all over, except the unfortunate remembrance in every part of Canada that I am to be remembered after the war as a profiteer.
While fortunes are being made and reputations shattered, Elsa Michener puts her knitting aside to produce shells. Manpower shortages had opened the doors of the munitions factories to women.
It was bitterly cold. Your feet were frozen, and the rest of you was just roasting because all the machinery was hot. You could smell the hot, molten metal. And when we were on the way out, there was one great big doorway where you could look and see. They'd open the furnace, and it would just look like hell.
It is barely more lucrative than office work and certainly more dangerous. The chemicals burn skin and ruin clothing. But Elsa Michener does her bit, her skin turning sallow, her hair orange. She is promoted to the position of inspector at Toronto's Fairbanks Morse shell factory. The worry and stress is taxing, and after a year and a half, she quits.
I couldn't stand that inspector's job. I couldn't stand it because some of the girls in that group, and some were my friends, were laughing and talking too much and not watching exactly what they were doing. And that worried me. I just had nightmares that I passed a shell that had been imperfect and might kill our own boys. I wanted to get out of it.
At the front, the 4 divisions of the Canadian Army are stockpiling an incredible amount of munitions for the greatest battle in their history, Vimy Ridge. Beneath the scarred landscape of Vimy Ridge, in these darkened tunnels, thousands of young Canadian soldiers prepare for battle. The night before Canada's greatest victory, they leave their mark in the soft chalk walls. For many, it will be their epitaph. From the height of the plateau, 150 kilometers from Paris, the Germans can see the entire region. The 4 Canadian divisions are ordered to take the ridge. A surprise attack is almost impossible. The slaughter at the Somme is still on General Arthur Currie's mind. Strategies must be completely revamped. A model of Vimy Ridge is set up. The troops measure and time the planned advance. And maps are issued to all the soldiers for the first time. Currie, commander of the 1st Canadian Division, writes to his mother.
Personally, I was never better. My hair is thinner and whiter, but otherwise I am all right. The division is in splendid form. I have never had more confidence in its fighting efficiency.
Claude Williams is the 21-year-old son of a Methodist minister from Hamilton, Ontario. He abandoned his medical studies to join the army.
Dear Father, if old Kaiser Bill only saw the preparations that have been made, he would throw up the sponge, I'm sure.
Vimy Ridge is covered with German trenches, shelters, and tunnels protected by barbed wire and machine guns. But the Canadians build an elaborate system of caves and tunnels of their own. They set up a railway to transport a massive amount of explosives. Claude Williams awaits 0 hour.
The attack was at daybreak. We had to lie in the open trenches all the night. The morning turned out gray, cold, and drizzling. Everybody shivering and chilled to the bone.
On April 9th, 1917, Canon Frederick Scott rises at 0400 hours.
Never was the spirit of comradeship higher in the Canadian Corps. Never was there a greater sense of unity.
There is no visual record of Vimy Ridge. Scenes from other battles help tell the story. The attack begins at 0530.
At the arranged time, to the absolute second, suddenly as dawn was breaking, every gun on the whole front opened up. The roar of the heavy guns was deafening.
A creeping barrage leads the attack, destroying enemy barbed wire. The infantry marches behind, doing the Vimy Glide, a 100-yard advance every 3 minutes, protected by a curtain of artillery fire. Canon Scott watches as the 4 Canadian divisions fight together for the very first time.
I knelt on the ground and prayed to the God of battles to guard our noblemen in that awful line of death and destruction and to give them victory. And I'm not ashamed to confess that it was with the greatest of difficulty I kept back my tears.
It is at Vimy Ridge that Mike Mountain Horse undergoes his baptism of fire.
Where is the God that the white man has taught the Indian to believe in? Why does he allow this terrible destruction? I pray that he might yet bring the nations to their senses.
Shoulder to shoulder, the men advance up the ridge as planned, routing the Germans from their trenches. The Canadian troops take and hold Vimy Ridge. Canadian soldiers make greater advances and capture more arms and more prisoners than any other Allied offensive since the start of the war. General Arthur Currie is elated.
A wonderful success. Every line was captured on time, every battalion doing equally well. The grandest day the Corps has ever had. The sight was awful and wonderful.
It is often said that the Battle of Vimy Ridge marks the true beginning of the Canadian nation. Vimy becomes a shared symbol for Canadians and a source of national identity and pride.
Dear Aunt Winnie, how is the baby? Daddy is very busy. I should tell you some news from the family. Mother and Carmen are dead. Daddy and I are safe.
Missing. Donald Cameron. Answers to Donnie. 4.5 years, fair hair, dark eyes. Wore red sweater or nightgown. Father anxious.
Richmond School, 84 dead. Annie MacDonald, George McClellan, Archie Orr, Catherine Pattison, Lizzie Taylor, Irene Travis, Gertrude Williams,
The people of Halifax are well acquainted with the war. Soldiers leave from their port. Soldiers return, wounded and worn. But on the morning of December 6, 1917, the war deals them a direct and deadly blow. The Norwegian freighter Emo is leaving the port, carrying much-needed supplies to the Belgian Relief Fund. The Mont Blanc, a French vessel, is arriving from New York to join a Canadian convoy set to cross the Atlantic. In order to avoid another vessel, the two ships find themselves in the same lane. At 8:45 a.m., the Emo hits the Mont Blanc. Thirteen-year-old James Pattison knows from the din in the harbor that this day will be like no other.
I was walking to Richmond School with my two brothers. Gordon was ahead of me, and my younger brother was right behind me. Catherine was homesick. The fire engines passed. Of course, we didn't know it was on fire. All we could hear was the alarms going, and the fire engines.
Other curious onlookers come to see the accident. And in schools, factories, and offices, everyone watches from the windows. No one knows that the Mont Blanc is carrying 3,000 tons of munitions and explosives.
didn't hear the explosion. We felt the concussion. Knocked us unconscious. It did come into my mind. Is this the end of the world? You couldn't hear a sound. Then things cleared off a little and you could hear noises. People screaming, and of course, you could hear the places burning.
The force of the explosion sets off the bells in all of the church steeples. The bells will toll for months as the people of Halifax bury their dead. James Pattison loses half of his family. His little brother Alan dies on the way to school. His 10-year-old sister Catherine is killed instantly at home. It is 4 months before his father Vincent's body is pulled from the wreckage of the sugar refinery where he worked. Over 6 square kilometers of Halifax are destroyed. The explosion kills 2,000 people and another 9,000 are wounded. The next day, the city is swept by a massive snowstorm, slowing the critical relief efforts. Many of the wounded are blinded, their eyes torn by shards of flying glass. A large number of children are orphaned. Lambert Griffith is a sailor from Red Deer, Alberta, and is aboard the Niobe, a Canadian warship stationed in the port. 2 days after the explosion, he scribbles a note to his wife.
Hundreds were killed in their houses miles away, even poor little children in their schools. There is to be a big funeral tomorrow, about 100 unidentified bodies to be buried. Thank God 100 times that you and the dear little girls were not here.
The tragedy happens 3 weeks before Christmas.
There will be no Christmas here, as it is a city of sorrow. Poor children without parents. We will get no leave. Do what you can, my old love.
The Halifax explosion is the most devastating disaster on Canadian soil, and the biggest man-made explosion in history. Until Hiroshima. The war that is devastating Europe threatens to tear Canada apart. And when the killing fields fall silent, Canada will not know peace. A plague will claim thousands of lives. Canadians will cry for reform and revolution. But this will soon become a decade of new ideas, new inventions, and unparalleled wealth. A boom some think will never end. In the summer of 1917, federal agents are combing the countryside, searching for more men to send to the front. In hundreds of Quebec villages, people take desperate measures to escape the sweep.
We went to Mass, and the priest says, "There's a man coming around to pick up married fellows with no children." So I tell my husband, "Your sister-in-law has a lot of children. Maybe she would lend me one." Oh, the kids started to cry. My sister-in-law, all of us cried and cried. And she explained to her kids, "If we don't lend them the baby, Uncle Jules will go to war. He'll get killed. We will never see him again."
Anna LaChapelle and her husband do what it takes to keep him from the front. Canada had promised to field an army of 500,000 men, but they are being mowed down faster than they can be replaced. Prime Minister Borden had also vowed that there would be no conscription. But when he goes overseas and visits wounded Canadian soldiers in British hospitals, he breaks his promise. Keeping Canada's commitment to them and to the Allies is a matter of honor.
If the survivors of these 400,000 men return to Canada feeling that they have been betrayed, have been abandoned, what will we tell them when they demand answers?
Conscription lands like a bombshell in Quebec. French-English tensions are already running high. French Canadians are enraged that Ontario has banned French as a language of instruction in its schools. They are in no mood to be forced to fight for England.
If we are asked to go fight for England, we will respond. Give us back our schools.
The Archbishop of Montreal, Monsignor Bruchesi, sends a warning to Prime Minister Borden.
Dear Sir Robert, do you not think, in light of our population, that we have largely done our share? The people are agitated. In the province of Quebec, we can expect deplorable revolts. Will this not end in bloodshed?
Dear Archbishop Bruchesi, I had the great privilege of looking into the eyes of tens of thousands of men at the front, who look to us for the effort which will make their sacrifice serve the great purpose for which it was undertaken. No one realizes more fully than I do the gravity and importance of the step which I have taken.
Henri Bourassa is firmly opposed to conscription, despite the jeers of Ontario columnists who refer to him as Herr Bourassa.
It is your duty, as Canadians and as British subjects, to do all you may possibly do to prevent the conscription bill from being voted. Your first duty as Canadians, whether of French or English blood, whether Catholic or Protestant, is to save Canada from ruin and suicide.
Sir Wilfrid Laurier, now leader of the opposition, is also convinced that conscription will tear the country apart.
Is it not true that the main reason advocated for conscription, not so much publicly as privately, not shouted but whispered, is that Quebec must be made to do her part, and French Canadians forced to enlist compulsorily, since they did not enlist voluntarily?
The debate is passionate, and not only in French Canada. In English Canada, many workers, farmers, and non-British immigrants also oppose conscription. The Reverend J.S. Woodsworth, a social reformer and pacifist from Winnipeg, is one of the few English Canadians bold enough to speak out against conscription.
I am not a pro-German. I am not a slacker or a coward. I had thought that as a Christian minister I was a messenger of the Prince of Peace. Christianity may be an impossible idealism, but so long as I hold it, ever so unworthily, I must refuse as far as may be to participate in or to influence others to participate in war.
Manitoba Labour leader Fred Dixon is maligned and beaten for his stance against conscription.
If I have to shed my blood, I would prefer to do it here, where I know it would be for freedom.
Despite furious objections, in August 1917, military service becomes obligatory for single men from 20 to 45. All summer, crowds in Quebec denounce conscription. Night after night, thousands march in Montreal. "19 days have passed since Anna LaChapelle borrowed her sister-in-law's baby.
I told my husband, look, there's a man coming to see us. My husband says, stay calm and rock the baby. My husband opens the door. Hello, sir, sits out a chair. But the man comes straight to me. You've got a pretty little baby. She looks just like you. He talked to us for a bit. Then he said he had to be going. The sweat was pouring down my back. I couldn't stand it.
In Ottawa, conscription destroys the Liberal Party. Laurier, who has spent his career working for French-English harmony, sees most of his English-speaking MPs desert him, joining Borden in a coalition government. The old man is devastated.
I find myself separated from colleagues whom I cherish like brothers. I follow my conscience just as they follow theirs. But this means we are living through tremors which, unless they subside, could shatter the country into pieces.
In October 1917, Borden calls an election. Conscription is the only issue.
Our first duty is to win. The ground must be carefully and completely prepared.
The Tories launch a strong campaign against Quebec. It becomes the foul blot on Canada. French Canadians are called slackers and cowards, and Wilfrid Laurier is depicted as a traitor. To ensure victory, Borden passes a draconian law, the Wartime Elections Act. All those who had come from enemy countries within the past 15 years are stripped of their right to vote. Others, however, are given the vote for the first time. Women who have a husband, son, or brother at the front. They are sure to support conscription. To no one's surprise, the Union government wins. But Borden is not out of trouble. 90% of conscripts ask for exemption, even amongst the English Canadians who voted so massively in favor of conscription. Borden responds by canceling all exemptions in April 1918. It is in Quebec City that Archbishop Bruchézy's worst fears come true. On Holy Thursday, a young man is arrested at a bowling alley for not having his registration papers with him. A mob gathers and turns violent. Canon Scott's wife, Amy, lives in Quebec City.
They ransacked the registrar's office in the auditorium building in their hunt for papers, set it on fire, and then turned their attention to the two government newspaper offices, L'Événement and the Chronicle, smashing everything to pieces.
The mob riots for 4 days. Soldiers from Ontario and the West are sent in. The evening of Easter Monday, 1918, ends in violence and death. Amy Scott writes to her husband.
Nothing can describe our feelings as we stand and listen to the rattle of machine guns, the shouts and cries of the angry mob, and think of the bloodshed and fighting that is going on a few hundred yards below us.
In all, 4 unarmed civilians are killed and dozens injured. Honoré Bergeron, a 49-year-old father of 6. Alexandre Bussière, a 25-year-old mechanic. Joseph-Édouard Tremblay, a 23-year-old student. And Georges Demeule, just 14 years old.
The army started shooting. The little Demeule kid was with us. We got down on all 4s along the sidewalk. The Demeule kid took off across the street and got hit. Next morning, when we got to work, pieces of flesh were still all over the fence where Demeule had been hit.
A year later, Sir Wilfrid Laurier is buried in Ottawa. Canada's conscripts had helped bring the war to an end in 1918. But Laurier's dream of unifying English and French Canadians has been shattered. Not since Louis Riel was hanged has the country been so divided. Laurier leaves these despairing words to those who would choose his successor.
Do not choose a French Canadian. The situation of a French Canadian Prime Minister is impossible, and he can do nothing for his people.
On November 11th, 1918, the armistice is signed. The war is finally over. People around the world fill the streets, kiss strangers, laugh, cry, dance, and sing. In Canada, there are parades and celebrations everywhere. And yet, even as people celebrate peace, a new horror has begun.
We were so glad the war was over, and our brave boys came home again. But what they found on their returning was worse than on the battle plain. For now they saw their sisters dying, mothers and fathers, brothers too. In all the world, no place is safe from the deadly grip of the Spanish flu.
The war may be over, but one of the most terrible epidemics in history rages on. The Spanish influenza kills more than 20 million people. In Canada, it claims almost as many lives as the Great War.
My mother, my older sister, and 4 brothers were ill with the flu. After 8 days, my mother, only 40 years old, got pneumonia and died. My father and I attended her funeral at 4 o'clock on November 11th, 1918, to the sounds of bells ringing for the armistice.
Many soldiers who are spared death on the battlefield return to find they have not escaped it at home. Lieutenant Arthur Joseph Lapointe arrives in his village.
My father, his face somber,
said to me, "We didn't want to tell you of the misfortune that had descended upon us, because we didn't know when you would be home, and we knew the news would make your life there unbearable. The terrible flu epidemic has taken 3 of your brothers and 2 sisters in just 9 days. It is not the return home that I dreamed of. It seems to me that my life will always be empty now. My God, if it was to know such suffering upon my return, why did I not die at the front, killed by a bullet?"
The soldiers' dreams of a better world after the war are not to be. Thousands of veterans are unemployed and unemployable. Canada is in debt. The cost of resettling returned soldiers and finding pensions for war widows and their families is huge. The returned men want jobs, bonus payments, and recognition. The veterans' efforts eventually lead to the adoption of one of the most generous pension plans for veterans in the world. This pension, however, does not offer benefits to native veterans. Along with Japanese Canadians, they also lose their wartime right to vote. Mike Mountain Horse returns as a hero with the Distinguished Conduct Medal.
We all had to behave like men in France, and I think I did so.
Following the custom of his people, he paints the story of his war experience on a cowhide robe. Roy McPhee comes home safe and sound. His brother Arthur also returns from the front, only to be killed a few months later in an explosion while clearing stumps. Frank Maheu goes back to the lumber camps, once again separated from his wife and children.
No use telling you that I'm lonesome. I am earning some money. And always, I think of you.
Nellie McClung's son, Jack, comes home without a scratch after 3 years in the trenches. But his mother knows that her son will never be the same.
I knew there was a wound in his heart, a sore place. That hurt look in his clear blue eyes tore at my heartstrings, and I did not know what to do. When a boy, who has never had a gun in his hands, never desired anything but the good of his fellow men, is sent out to kill other boys like himself, even at the call of his country, something snaps in him, something which may not mend.
Canon Scott returns to the pulpit of his Anglican church in Quebec City. In spite of the loss of his son Harry, he has not lost hope for his country. The Treaty of Versailles at the end of the war awards Canada her own place in the League of Nations. Canon Scott preaches a fresh, proud Canadian outlook.
Pessimists and alarmists are lamenting the unsettlement of the times. But when we consider that we were plunged in a war, the end and duration of which we could not foresee, I think the settlement of our condition today is a marvelous achievement and testifies to the common sense and sanity of our young country.
The war may be over, but Canada is about to enter a period of tumult unlike anything it has known before. It will begin in Winnipeg, at the corner of Portage and Main.
How dare you ask a man to go out and risk his life? And when he returns, calmly request him to hand in his uniform, and in exchange, hand him a pittance that will reduce a once self-respecting citizen to a miserable pauper, dependent on either charity or friends.
Helen Armstrong is worried about the bleak future facing returning soldiers in the working class after the war. Fred Dixon is angry about the past.
Those responsible for the Ross rifle, defective shells, shoddy clothes, paper boots, and the whole black record of profiteering gave 10,000 times more aid and comfort to the enemy than all the socialists and conscientious objectors put together.
People were expecting a better world after the misery of war. Instead, many people cannot find jobs. Inflation is rampant. Round steak is up from 10 cents to 39 cents a pound, and coffee has doubled in price. Tensions are mounting all over Canada. It is in Winnipeg that they will explode. The city's building and metal workers demand the right to bargain through more powerful centralized unions. Winnipeg's employers refuse. Fred Gordienko, a Ukrainian blacksmith, works in a CNR shop.
I meet a union leader in the street. He tells me, Fred, we can't avert a strike. We have to go because they don't want absolutely to take consideration of what we want. He told me, we don't like strike, but we're forced to do it because the other way? How do you defend your rights?
Blacksmith, local 61. 121.46 against.
When their demands aren't met, the building and metal workers walk off the job on May 1st, 1919. It is an ordinary strike, but it sparks an extraordinary response. It has only been 18 months since the Tsar of Russia was overthrown, following a general strike in Petrograd. Talk of revolution is sweeping the world, and militants promote the idea of the general strike, the shutting down of entire cities, as the only way of achieving their goal here at home. On May 15th, a general strike is called in Winnipeg. The first to walk out are the Hello Girls, Winnipeg's telephone operators. Within 2 hours, the city is almost completely paralyzed. 30,000 union and non-union workers leave their jobs. Sympathy strikes break out all across the country. Ottawa fears a Bolshevik revolution. It is up to Arthur Meehan, acting Minister of Justice, to stifle the strike before Canadians panic.
The leaders of the general strike are all revolutionists of varying degrees and types, from crazy idealists to ordinary thieves.
J.S. Woodsworth returns to his hometown from Vancouver to see if he can help his old friends. Soon he is working with Fred Dixon at the Western Labor News, printing a daily strike bulletin.
This strike is not engineered from Russia. In reality, the strike has nothing to do with revolution. It is an attempt to meet a very pressing and immediate need. The organized workers, like everyone else, are faced with the high cost of living. Like most people, they imagine that if they can get higher wages, they can buy more food.
Winnipeg's employers fight back. The Citizens Committee of 1,000, led by A.J. Andrews, unites them against the workers.
The only way to deal with Bolshevism is to hit it, and to hit it hard, every time it lifts its ugly head.
Ottawa takes direct aim at the strike leaders, making it easier to deport immigrants without trial.
They say one of our strike leaders is a German. I don't care what a man is if he's whole under the skin and a worker. The only enemy alien we have in Canada is the capitalist and the strikebreaker.
As head of the Women's Labor League, Helen Armstrong organizes the women workers and workers' wives. She spends 3 days in jail on a charge of inciting to disorder.
Peace is all right for the folk who ride in automobiles and the thugs in red coats who do their bidding. There will be no peace for the worker until we get a living wage and proper living conditions.
For 6 weeks, the strike committee virtually runs Winnipeg. The city fires all but 16 policemen, and anti-strike specials are sworn in to replace them. The Royal Northwest Mounted Police, the Redcoats, are also brought in. On June 10th, a crowd gathers to hear a speech. The special police try to disperse them. A riot breaks out, in which one police officer is injured. The strikers seem to be winning. Business leaders are panicked and demand harsh measures. The federal authorities step in and arrest the strike leaders. Helen Armstrong's husband, George, is one of 10 strike leaders arrested and spirited away to Stony Mountain Penitentiary. To protest this extraordinary action, veterans who support the strike organize a silent parade on June 21st in defiance of a ban by Winnipeg's Mayor Charles Gray. A large crowd of 6,000 gathers in front of City Hall. A streetcar operated by strikebreakers approaches on its route. The veterans overturn it and set it on fire. The mounted police charge.
People were excited. I was in the corner where the shooting started. I see the mounted police turn the corner and one of the horses fall down. And after that, 2 or 3 mounted police get mixed up with that. Someone falls, someone jumps.
One man, standing on the sidewalk, thought the Mounties were firing blank cartridges until a spectator standing beside him dropped with a bullet through his breast. Another standing nearby was shot through the head. Lines of special police swinging their big clubs were thrown across Main Street and the intersecting thoroughfares. Dismounted redcoats lined up, declaring military control.
2 people are killed. 94 are arrested. Like the conscription riots of Quebec City, once again a popular demonstration is brutally repressed. "40 days after it began, the largest social revolt in Canadian history has been crushed.
Whoever ordered the shooting last Saturday is a Kaiser of the deepest dye."
Following Bloody Saturday, Fred Dixon publishes an article that leads to charges of seditious conspiracy. At his trial, he pleads to the jury to defend free speech.
Liberty of opinion. That is what is on trial. I advised men to use their ballots and keep the peace. You are the last hope so far as the liberty of the subject is concerned. In your hands is placed the question of liberty of speech, whether a man has a right to criticize government officials or not.
Dixon is acquitted. Many others are jailed or deported. Fred Gordienko is asked to leave his blacksmith's job.
they start to lay off after the strike. The Russian, the immigrants, start to lay them off, and then they come to lay me off too. The union try to fight. They say, if you want, we will fight for you. I said, this job in the shop. The smoke, the dirt, is not worth to put all the union to fight. And so we went, about 5 of us.
In the years to come, there will be other defining clashes between labor and capital. Glace Bay, Nova Scotia, is virtually occupied by the army during a bitter strike in 1925. And beyond the factories and smelters, a new movement is arising, one that will reshape the political face of Canada.
Great generals and great colonels over there. Your big guns and your aeroplanes are flying through the air. Of course they all were needed, but this thing you must allow. They couldn't win the war without the man behind the plow.
Farmers across Canada are tired and disillusioned with traditional politics. The promise not to conscript their sons was broken in 1918. A post-war economic slump threatens their livelihood. And now the young are heading to the cities, leaving the land. Agnes MacPhail grew up on a farm in Grey County, Ontario. She is a school teacher now, but remains keenly aware of the farmer's plight.
To farm is the most arduous and most poorly paid of all occupations. Farmers work 12 hours a day to feed people who work 8 hours, and still some people call that a square deal.
The time has come for the farmers to defend their interests, and like the workers in Winnipeg, they organize.
A class of idle rich has grown up in our cities, to whose love of ostentation, commerce, and industry are now pandering. These enervated and miserable specimens of humanity rush about the country in great cars, flaunt their wealth in our faces, tear up our roads, and cast their dust upon our fields.
W.C. Good is one of the organizers of the United Farmers of Ontario. He is a farmer, writer, and inventor. Good decries the wheat dealers who control the price of grain and the city-born politicians who are indifferent to farmers. Agnes MacPhail becomes a convert and a rousing speaker herself.
Your grandparents and mine are the real builders of this country. They built the foundation of the country strong and true. And if we sit around and let the captains of the city so undermine it that this land for which they toiled so hard is taken out of our hands by the fiscal policy of this Dominion, we are not worthy of our heritage.
The United Farmers of Ontario become a powerful political force, winning the provincial election in 1919. Then the tide turns west. The leader of the United Farmers of Alberta is Henry Wise Wood. He came to Canada from the U.S. in 1906. over 100,000 Americans had settled in the prairies, bringing with them a tradition of protest.
We as farmers are downtrodden by every other class. We have groveled and been ground into the dirt. We are determined that this shall not be. We will organize for our protection. We will nourish ourselves and gain strength, and then we shall strike out in our might and overthrow our enemies.
The farmers consider the established parties inherently corrupt and decide they can create a better alternative. Irene Parlby's initiative in organizing a farm women's club exposed political talents she had never imagined she would use. She begins campaigning in the 1921 provincial election for the United Farmers of Alberta. On election day, the UFA sweeps away the Liberals, winning a clear majority. Irene Parlby wins a seat, becoming Alberta's first woman cabinet minister in a government dominated by politically inexperienced farmers. But they do have ideals.
The future is to the strong, but my idea deals with moral values, not with physical strength. Strength to do the right thing in the face of any temptation. The moral strength that alone can give us clean government, can abolish the patronage system, despotism, corruption, bribery, and all the other ills of our political system.
By 1921, when a federal election is called, farmers are ready to take their crusade onto the national stage. The Progressive Party is born. Agnes MacPhail runs as a candidate for the Progressives in Grey County, Ontario. She is the first woman to run for office at the federal level.
There is one more battle to fight, one more victory to win. The date is December 6th, and the sword is the ballot. Vote early and vote right. And by 6 p.m., our country will have been redeemed from the greedy hand of the spoiler.
William Lyon Mackenzie King, the new Liberal leader, becomes Prime Minister. The Progressives win enough seats to form the official opposition, but refuse the role because they believe each member should vote according to local wishes, not along party lines. The political map of Canada will never be the same. At the age of 31, Agnes MacPhail becomes the first woman to sit in the House of Commons.
On my desk the first day, I found a bouquet bearing on the card an unfamiliar name. I was much interested until I found that it was the loser of a wager who bought the flowers. Poor chap. Well, I enjoyed them anyway.
MacPhail will be the only woman in Parliament until 1929, when the first woman senator is named. Earlier that year, the Alberta Five: Emily Murphy, Nellie McClung, Irene Parlby, Louise McKinney, and Henrietta Muir-Edwards went all the way to the British Privy Council with the Persons Case. It is ruled that women are persons and as such can sit in the Senate. It is a landmark in the movement for women's rights in Canada. Florentine Maher had always lived in the small Quebec village of Warwick. She is 32 and the mother of 6 children. When her husband, Upton, a cheese inspector, is asked to relocate to Montreal, Florentine is delighted.
My childhood dream is coming true. Living in town and doing all the things I love. We moved to Montreal in August 1922.
Thousands of rural families flood the cities, despite the pleas of traditionalists who see the city as a corrupting evil where assimilation and American values rule. Florentine Maher loves the diversity of city life.
In our street, there were all kinds of people. Day workers, the wealthy, the unemployed, a milkman, and 2 Italian families, the Colangelos and the Materesses.
Thousands of Canadians are also moving to American cities, including Florentine's sister and her family. Between 1921 and 1931, almost 1 million Canadians moved south, mostly from Quebec and the Maritimes. Alexandre Taschereau, the Liberal Premier of Quebec, has a plan to stem the tide. Taschereau solicits American investment in the development of Quebec's largely untapped natural resources.
There is a factor in our national expansion that the government will not neglect. That of the preservation of our population and the repatriation of our people who live in the United States.
Premier Taschereau is generous to a fault. He makes deals for land and privileges. Many Quebec towns boom as a result of the massive influx of capital from pulp and paper and mining investors. Henri Bourassa worries that Premier Taschereau is selling off the nation's jewels. The two face off in the Quebec legislature.
At this rate, American capital will soon rule over Canada and Canadians. We could and should be alarmed. We should not be surprised. It's the direct result of our wartime spending spree. We wanted to play the part of a great nation. We've gone bankrupt to save civilization and democracy. We are now at the mercy of our neighbors. They grew rich at the game that ruined us.
Premier Taschereau is unapologetic.
I am not afraid, and I will never be afraid, that our French Canadians will become Americanized because of an inflow of American capital. They have resisted other dangers and other trials. And as I have said many times, I prefer to import an American dollar than to export a Canadian worker.
All across Canada, American dollars give the economic recovery a very big boost. Pulp and paper is Canada's leading export, and Americans own more than 1/3 of Canada's pulp production. Canadians also drive American cars, and American-owned automotive plants stretch in a thin line from Oshawa to Windsor. By the end of the decade, the American Big Three manufacture 3/4 of the cars purchased in Canada. Florentine Maher and her family take vacations in their brand new sedan.
Our second car was a McLaughlin Buick. We would go to Saint-François-du-Lac with friends, the kids all dressed up. Things were getting better, and whatever new gadget was out there, My husband would buy it.
After years of hard times, people just want to have fun. Lotta Dempsey is a young reporter for the Edmonton Bulletin during the heady days of the 20s.
By now, I was pantingly compensating for my wallflower days at school. There were lots of beaux to go around, and we danced, skated, went canoeing on the river, had wonderful weekends in Jasper and Banff, and sang around home pianos.
Florentine Maher's favorite activity is the cinema.
I wouldn't miss an opportunity. I had lived so long without any of these distractions. So often I would go to the Plaza Theatre on Sunday afternoons. They'd be showing the silent films of Charlie Chaplin and Harold Lloyd. I was young and loved to laugh. It was so much fun.
There's also a new craze in the 1920s, radio. Hockey Night in Canada is one of the most popular programs. But as the decade progresses, American radio shows are increasingly popular, and Canadian culture has a hard time finding its place in the market.
What you doing, Andy?
Hello there, Amos. Just checking my bank account, yeah.
Oh, wow, oh, wow, oh, wow.
Still in her 20s, Lotta Dempsey is sent off in 1929 to interview Canadian actress Mary Pickford, who has left Canada to become a movie star in Hollywood.
I came home aglow with adventure and determined to repay the boss with good performances, then to take off to farther fields. But something had happened while I was on the train journey back. The date was October 24th, 1929. The stock market had crashed. Depression was upon us. It was as simple as that.
While the Depression rages, Lotta Dempsey will provide for her parents. She still has a job, though her salary is cut by half. For Canadians, the days of war and the days of dancing are over.